Okay, good afternoon, everybody. Now, I hope that you can all hear me. Um, and today, I'm actually going to be discussing very, very briefly some of viral infections. Of course, there are many, many, many viral infections to talk about. Um, uh, but I've just selected a few, which I think are particularly important, but also which are relevant and which show different aspects of how viruses cause illness. So forgive me for having abbreviated our discussion of viral disease, but as you know, we're running out of time. I think this week that I might actually put in an extra shorter class, maybe on Friday, if you don't mind, just to get us caught up so that I don't have to rush through the bacterial infections, which are really, really important. Okay, so we discussed at length the basic biology of viruses and how viruses function and everything. But you'll be aware that human beings are subject to many, many, many different viral infections. And in fact, we are continuously exposed to viruses. And a major part of our immune system is devoted to dealing with viral infections. So let's talk about some of the ones that we have all experienced, and then talk about some of the more rare ones. So first of all, probably one of the commonest sets of illnesses that we get from viruses are what we refer to as the common cold. In actual fact, the common cold we recognize by a set of symptoms. And those symptoms are written or seem to us usually to be about the same. And we might reasonably assume that they arose from one particular virus. It's not true. In actual fact, there are many, many, many different viruses which cause this relatively limited, relatively mild illness that we know as the common cold. Most human beings, in fact, have a cold about once or twice a year. There is a famous quote, by the way, in the Quran. In the Arab society, it was believed that, in fact, having a cold once or twice a year was a healthy thing, that it was good for your mental health. And in the Quran, there is a quotation. They said in Medina that I was mad, even though I had had a cold twice that year. Well, it's not so extraordinary. It turns out that having a cold is indeed good for your mental health. And that it's probably simply because it gives you a very good excuse to get to bed, to relax and not to think about anything else for a day or two while your body deals with the virus. We know the symptoms. We usually start a couple of days feeling that something is going on. We may be a little sniffly cold, but nothing really much. And then gradually we progress to having sore throat, runny nose, sneezing, often streaming eyes. But here's the thing about the common cold, and that is very seldom does it produce a major fever. Usually, if the temperature is elevated at all, it's barely elevated. And often there's no temperature at all. Common cold usually does not have an associated headache either, unless you're suffering from sinus along with it, in which case you can get a sinus headache. But headache is not one of the symptoms associated with common cold. Does have muscle ache very often and fatigue. And I'll remind you that these symptoms, fever, muscle ache, and fatigue, are actually mostly produced by your own immune system. These symptoms are usually produced, these are symptomatic of your immune system actually responding to the presence of the virus. Very rarely, you may have a dry cough, but a common cold is mostly associated with the upper respiratory tract. and not with the lower respiratory tract. It can progress that if you have a severe cold, you can get a cough with a subsequent bacterial infection. But that is not usually a dry cough. That is usually a productive cough, and it's due to a secondary infection, not to the virus itself. So let's have a look at some of the causes. As I told you, there are more than 200 of these viruses that can cause common symptoms of the common cold. But one of the commonest is this one, the rhinovirus. And rhino means nose. And here is one here. You'll remember structure of the viruses. It's an enveloped virus. These red patches here are the proteins, the viral proteins, which will allow it to bind to the correct cells. And the cold viruses mostly begin their infection by binding to cells of the mucous membranes of the upper respiratory tract. There's a good reason for that, and that is that this virus seems to prefer a slightly lower than body temperature. This is probably one of the reasons why your immune system raises your temperature. Viruses often do not do particularly well at a higher temperature. So, but in common cold, your temperature seldom is raised very much at all. That's much more, as you will hear later, much more a symptom of influenza. Now, all of the common cold viruses, you'll know, they spread like wildfire. They assume almost epidemic proportions, especially in fall and in winter. And this is largely because they are spread by respiratory droplets. And you know that one of the major symptoms of having a cold is sneezing, running nose, sneezing. And this spreads droplets in the air, which can be inhaled directly. But another feature of a common cold is they are very easily spread by fomites. So droplets landing on a table surface, a door handle, anything like that. People have runny noses. What do they do the whole time, even without thinking about it? They wipe their noses and then touch something and leave virus behind. So a major route of infection for common cold is not only inhaling the droplets directly, but is picking up virus and then transferring it directly to a mucous membrane, the nose or the eyes, for example, by touching. In cold season, we've all learned this now from COVID so well. It's second nature to us now. This trying to keep our hands clean, trying to keep our hands away from our faces, all of this sort of thing. It's very good practice in general because this finger to face transmission is actually a major route of transmission of virus. Common cold virus seldom causes any major problems. It is usually very limited, 5 days or so. The one thing about it that distinguishes it, as we will hear, from influenza, it has a long prodromal period. There is a long period of infection where you are not actually ill. You may feel like something is going on, but you're not actually ill. And the symptoms build relatively gradually. Then a day or two in bed, and you on your way to recovery, usually, unless you get a secondary bacterial infection. Here's another one that causes common cold. And this is adenovirus. And adenovirus I mentioned here because it can actually, this is one where it can actually progress to a slightly more severe illness, because adenovirus can actually produce a fever and an intense sore throat, which is a direct effect of the virus and then of your immune system attacking cells that have been infected with the virus. And it also has cough associated directly with the virus, which is unusual for cold viruses. I will just also mention, by the way, that along with the rhinoviruses, there are at least 3 coronaviruses, which are very well known and have been for a very long time. closely related to the coronavirus that we are dealing with at the moment. But these 3 coronaviruses that cause common cold, they just cause mild illness with these exact symptoms. They do not cause a serious illness at all. But those 3 have been well known for a long time. Okay, so the thing about common cold is that that's a strictly upper respiratory tract. Only very rarely does it progress to anything else in the lungs or anything like that. However, we also need to talk about this influenza. You will very often hear people say, I've been off school because I had flu, when in fact what they had was a common cold. And the 2 need to be distinguished because they are 2 completely different illnesses. Influenza always has the possibility of becoming a serious illness. Influenza is far more of a systemic illness than the common cold, which tends to remain in the upper respiratory tract. Influenza can have impact over upper respiratory tract, lower respiratory tract, gastrointestinal tract as well. And it has some really important relationships to our immune system that I will mention. Again, there are similarities to the common cold because a lot of its early symptoms are also upper respiratory tract, sniffling, sore throat, that sort of thing. But with influenza, a lot more is going on than happens with the common cold. Influenza has been an extremely serious illness for human beings and a major control of human populations in actual fact for millennia. And when looking through a historical record, we see that there's at least 30 major influenza pandemics that have swept through the human population since the 1500s, when the symptoms were first described. And may well have been going on before that. We just didn't have a description. On the other hand, it may have entered the human population sometime around then. We're uncertain. Here's the thing that makes influenza so special. Influenza they are a group of viruses, the influenza viruses, which can infect 3 hosts, and they are humans, poultry, and allied species. So, ducks, geese, but wild ducks and things like that as well, and then pigs. And pigs, ducks, and humans frequently come into very close contact with one another, especially in farming communities, and they have done for a very long time. And each of those species, humans, pigs, and poultry, they have their own influenza viruses, but they can cross-infect. We can cross-infect between species, and unfortunately, we can hybridize. In a way, it's difficult to say that you hybridize a virus, but that's one way you can think about it. We can hybridize a virus between birds, humans, and pigs, and end up creating effectively entirely new influenza virus. And this is the huge danger of influenza, that every now and again, that is what happens. It's an extremely dangerous zoonotic disease, a disease derived from animal populations. And every now and again, every 20, 30 years, whatever, an entirely new influenza virus derived from animal stocks usually enters the human population, and the human population has absolutely no resistance to it at all. It's a brand new virus, as new as the coronavirus is now. And it careens through the human population. Whether or not those new species cause serious illness is a different matter. Sometimes they do, sometimes they don't. And I'll mention 2 of these pandemics, with quite different outcomes. Okay, so if we have a look, first of all, the disease itself. Here's the thing that absolutely distinguishes influenza from the common cold, and that is it's usually associated with headache and with high fever. The other thing is that that has a very short prodromal phase, and the onset of symptoms is usually extremely sudden. This is the sort of thing you're doing your normal thing, and all of a sudden, bam, you've got this blinding headache that arrives within a half an hour or so. You're feeling really ill. That is typical for influenza, the sudden onset of symptoms. There is a very strong association with fatigue and with muscle and joint pain. This is probably a mixture of effects of the virus itself and response from your immune system. Unfortunately, one of the things that influenza virus does is that it can excite an extremely vigorous immune response. And this may, in fact, be one of the things that makes the disease extremely dangerous. And I'll give you a specific instance where we believe this was true. The other thing is that influenza has a much greater propensity for lower respiratory tract infections. So the virus can infect deep into the lungs, directly causing cough, causing inflammation, and even pneumonia directly from the virus itself. But also it's very dangerous because it sets your lower respiratory tract up for very serious bacterial secondary infections. And pneumonias, bacterial pneumonias, are very strongly associated with influenza, especially in the elderly. And this is one of the reasons why influenza is a major killer of people over the age of 65. So the first thing to notice the differences between colds and flu: higher fever, and sudden onset of headache. Also, it is a much more serious illness, and people who believe they have flu, feel like they have flu, are well advised to get to bed and to really treat it seriously. This high fever, I just want to mention something. We do have a propensity for rushing to the medicine cabinet as soon as we start to feel ill and filling ourselves up with aspirin or Tylenol or whatever. This high fever is actually part of your immune response. And as I told you, it is a response to viral infection very often to try and slow the viral replication down. So it might not always be a good idea to immediately try to lower fever. But if the fever if it moves over like 101, for example, then it probably does need to start to be controlled. Okay, so here is the virus itself. It has a strange structure. First of all, it's an enveloped virus, and it's an RNA virus. So, but the genome is cut up into 8 different pieces: 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, each with their own little capsid around them. Each of these is like a separate packet of genes, and the whole thing comprises the genome. So here, the whole thing comprises all the recipes for the virus. It is an enveloped virus. So here's in the envelope derived from host membrane, but embedded in the membrane, there are these proteins. There are 2 of real importance in influenza. This one here, depicted with an arrow, is called hemagglutinin. There it is there. And hemagglutinin is a very variable protein, but it is the protein that allows the influenza virus to bind to the correct host cell and to penetrate. There are 17 known kinds of hemagglutinin, H1 to H17, and there are probably more which need to be discovered. Then the second type of protein, viral protein, is this one, neuraminidase. And neuraminidase is what induces the budding of the mature virus from the host cell and its release. And there are 10 kinds of neuraminidase. And hemagglutinin is denoted H, and neuraminidase denoted N. And you may well have heard of influenza strains being described, for example, as an H1N1 strain. That means that particular strain has this hemagglutinin and this neuraminidase. But these proteins are very variable, and they can vary in minor ways, and they can vary in major ways. And it's important for us to understand both of those, whether they are major changes or minor changes. And I'll explain in a second. There are 3 kind of species of influenza virus. There are influenza A and influenza B are the ones that we actually have to worry about. But influenza A is by far the most important. Influenza A is the one we see circulating every year, and it's the one that causes the epidemics. Influenza B, we usually do see some of it every year. If you follow the notifications in the newspaper or whatever during flu season, they will tell you how prevalent influenza B is. Usually much less prevalent and less severe. It is influenza A that we've got to really worry about. That's the species we need to worry about. There's a third one which causes milder illness called influenza C. The vaccine that we get each year for influenza is a mixture. Most of it is influenza A. There's usually at least 2 types of influenza A in the vaccine, and then they will include of influenza B if it looks like it is prevalent. So I'm going to explain a little bit about how we get the different changes in a while, but I just want to mention that there are some, in addition to the severity of the illness itself, which can be very, very severe, in fact mortal, there are some complications which are specifically associated with influenza. And one of them is this Guillain-Barré syndrome, which is a paralytic syndrome, which ends up damaging nerves, probably a result. It's a very mysterious syndrome. Nobody really knows why it occurs, but it usually occurs after a viral infection, and it is most commonly occurs after an influenza infection. It's not, the syndrome itself is not common at all. It's rare, but where it does occur, it's often as a result of an influenza infection. The other one is this one. Those of you who have children, you need to be extremely careful if they have influenza, or you think they may have influenza, and not to give them aspirin, because it produces this syndrome called Ray's syndrome, which can be a serious syndrome. Is everyone all right? Can you hear me okay? Am I going too fast?
It's good.
Okay, fine. I'm pretty much sticking to my PowerPoints, so you know you have that as your reference.
Sorry,
okay.
Professor, to interrupt
yes,
you.
Go ahead.
Do you know up to what age they shouldn't drink aspirin?
I think it's basically up to puberty. I'm not 100% sure. You should ask though. You should, and I know it's more prevalent in smaller children.
Oh, okay.
But yeah, it's definitely something as flu season comes around, it's something to ask your practitioner about. Okay, so here's the huge danger with the influenza viruses, is that they change so much. They are highly mutable. They undergo mutations, but they undergo 2 kinds of mutation. They undergo minor changes continually. Those hemagglutinin and neuraminidase spikes undergo small changes, but those small tiny changes in the structure of the protein are enough that from year to year, our immune systems can't recognize them well. We may be able to recognize them to a certain extent, but we do not produce a good, strong antibody response when one of these new small variants arises. And this happens the whole time. The influenza virus is moving around the world from infection to infection the whole time. It moves from northern hemisphere to southern hemisphere with the seasons. It's present all year, but it's predominantly in winters, fall and winter, that we see it most. That is because of the impact of weather on the survival of the droplets in the air, and also survival on fomites. So for all year, the virus is circulating around the globe, and it's accumulating small mutations that by the time it comes back around the next season to us, our immune systems can't recognize it anymore. Even if we were immune the year before, we are susceptible to these new, and this is a new strain of virus. It's not a major difference in the viral structure or anything, or in its genome. It's just small mutational changes that we refer to as antigenic drift. And it's the reason we need to get new vaccines every year. What they do, there's a committee that sits and watches as the virus makes its way around the globe every year. And they look in every city and every country, and they try and pick those that they think might become epidemic or pandemic. And that's what goes into the vaccine. The vaccines are well known, and they are quickly produced every year, so that we get new ones every year. Some years they work better than other years. Some years they may pick the wrong strain and whatever. But these are not major new species of influenza. So they may cause problems, but they don't cause widespread major illness usually. A different story arises when we get a major genetic shift in the influenza, in the structure of the genome, and an entirely new combination of of hemagglutinin and neuraminidase spikes, and very often entirely new hemagglutinin spikes. Now no longer just small changes, but entirely new hemagglutinin spikes may arise. This is primarily influenza A, and this is what causes the great influenza epidemics. So I'll explain it to you just briefly. We have three hosts. We have pigs, we have ducks, and we have human beings that in close contact with one another. They each have their own particular species of influenza that infect them, but they can cross-infect to a certain extent. Birds can infect human beings directly. We can acquire avian influenza viruses, and this can be extremely serious, especially if the virus that we acquire from the bird can be transmitted to other human beings. Often, this happens more often than epidemics happen, because sometimes infection occurs and that the new virus cannot be passed on to other human beings, so it just ends there. But sometimes the virus acquired from birds can be passed to other humans, and then it can be extremely serious. So that's one route there. Birds can infect pigs, and humans can infect pigs as well. Pigs don't usually infect humans directly with pig virus. So bird virus, yes. Birds can infect pigs, yes. Humans can infect pigs, and we refer to pigs as being the mixing vessel. Because if pigs get infected with both bird and human virus, we can shuffle the genomes of these, and we can end up producing an entirely new strain, a new, not even strain, a new species of influenza. And this is the source of many of the human epidemics that have proved extremely deadly to human beings. So we can have virus from birds. Birds can give it to pigs. Humans can give it to pigs, and pigs can give humans a mixture of the two. And this results in what we refer to as antigenic shift. It is a major change in the genome, which allows a new virus to infect human beings from an animal source. So just to summarize, this tells you basically the same thing. Every year, we deal with antigenic drift. It's little minor changes in the protein spikes, enough that our immune systems lose track of them, and we need a new vaccine each year. But with the other two hosts, in addition to humans, we can acquire directly from birds, and there's quite a lot of mutational change can happen in the bird populations before it transmits to humans. So we may be seeing an entirely new species from the bird. But we also, birds and humans can infect pigs, and pigs can infect us with those combinations. And in that case, we dealing with entirely new species of the influenza virus. And this can be a huge problem. So there's just something which you can't see. I need to just move out of the way. Okay. So the one influenza epidemic that I'm sure you have all heard of, and if you haven't heard of it, then please, you need to go and look it up, is the great Spanish, it's called the Spanish flu epidemic. It was not Spanish at all. The only reason it got called Spanish was because Spain was the one country that alerted its population in the press, told them what to do. And so they called it the Spanish flu. It actually arose in America. And the Spanish flu was an H1N1 flu, and it was acquired directly from poultry, not with a pig intermediary. It was acquired from poultry. And it was an absolutely deadly flu. It went around the world, killed millions upon millions of people. It had a very high mortality rate, case mortality rate, more than 5%. And it was very peculiar because most viral illnesses kill specific age groups. They usually kill very young people, like infants and small children, and they kill very old people. But the Spanish flu, it did kill very, very young infants, but it didn't particularly affect children, and it didn't particularly affect old people either, but it killed people between the ages of about 25 and 40 selectively. And it killed them quickly and in a terrible way. It behaved almost like a hemorrhagic flu, a hemorrhagic fever. People would begin hemorrhaging from lung tissue, hemorrhaging from their nose, from the eyes. It was a very, very, very terrible illness. And it's now believed that one of the reasons for that was that it excited this unbelievably powerful response from the immune system, and that most people died because of an overaction of their immune system. Now that should ring a bell. If you've been following the COVID epidemic, that is believed to be one of the reasons why COVID is so deadly in some cases, is that it excites a very, very strong immune response, and it is the immune response that actually ends up causing the most severe symptoms. So this was the Spanish flu. Here it is here, 1918, the end of the First World War, which was one of the reasons why it spread so rapidly. It spread from America to Europe because soldiers were going there. It came back from Europe to America because soldiers were returning. But it was a pandemic. Since then, we've had a number of other epidemics. Here's one here. This was called the Asian influenza. And the Asian influenza was an H2N2, H1N1 combination. And that was in swine, in pigs. So we acquired it from pigs. This one here is the Hong Kong flu in 1968, 1969. I have personal experience of that because I had it. I was sick, but not terribly sick. It was a bad influenza. There were, in fact, quite a high mortality, but mostly in elderly people. And this again was an avian virus and a human virus, which recombined in pigs. The most recent one occurred in the early part of this century, 2002, 2004, around about there. It's been drifting around. When it first entered, there was absolute panic. It was called the swine flu. And again, it was an avian virus, human virus combination in pigs, which entered the human population. And when it was first appeared, epidemiologists all around the world were extremely concerned because this, as you can see, this is a bad combination. But in fact, it turned out it was not as serious as the illness it caused was not as serious as had been anticipated. It was, and it, although it wasn't seen as a worldwide pandemic, it was really not very serious at all. We really dodged a bullet. But of course, unfortunately, influenza is not the only virus that we have to worry about. We also have to worry about COVID. And these epidemics, although it's different, entirely different virus and entirely different origin, these actually tell us quite a lot about how we should be dealing with epidemics. In the case of the swine flu, we had good notification that the epidemic might be on its way. They immediately began research for vaccines. They immediately began all sorts of preparatory, getting the PPE, everything ready, getting ready to isolate people, all the rest of it. Fortunately, it turned out that it wasn't necessary. But unfortunately, when COVID came, we lacked many of those preparations. So here is the beast that we need to talk about now, which is our current epidemic, which is SARS-CoV-2. SARS stands for severe acute respiratory syndrome. It may sound like overkill, but there is another group of illnesses called the acute respiratory syndrome virus. And so this is severe acute respiratory syndrome, and it's coronavirus 2. Here it is here. I've showed it to you before, I think. It's an enveloped positive strand RNA virus. Here are the viral proteins embedded in the envelope on the outside. And these are the proteins which are responsible for binding and entry into the host cell. There are another group of coronavirus, SARS and SARS-associated coronaviruses. This is not the only one that we know of, but all of the severe respiratory syndrome coronaviruses have entered the human population very recently. The coronaviruses that cause common cold, they have probably been in the human population for a very long time. And that we've adapted to them what they have adapted to us. That's why they don't cause much illness. This disease here, SARS-CoV-1, also arose as SARS-CoV-2 did in China. And it's this SARS-CoV-1 is an extremely, extremely virulent disease. And I'll discuss it a little bit more in a while. So all of these coronaviruses have an interesting origin. They are believed to all be zoonotic. They arise in animal populations. And for some strange reason, we do not really understand why, they are strongly associated with bat populations. But those which enter the human population and infect humans pass through another mammal source. And it's probably simply because we don't have that much contact with bats. It's animals that are in the wild and everything that acquire the coronaviruses secondarily and then pass it to us. And you'll see all of these. This is a civet. That's SARS-CoV-1. This is a camel, and that is a disease called MERS, Middle East Respiratory Syndrome, an extremely virulent disease. This is our SARS-CoV-2. MERS is associated with camels. SARS is believed to be associated with pangolins, although we have yet to know that definitively. Each of these civets, camels, and pangolins and civets are actually used both in for feeding, for eating, and as a source of Chinese medicine or Far East medicines. So there's close contact between humans and these. Camels, obviously, they're draft animals, and there's strong contact. So this is the origins of the coronaviruses. Coronaviruses appear to be very promiscuous. They can pass into different hosts. But what is really important is for the human being is whether they can then be passed from human to human. If they can't be passed from human to human, then the infection chain ends. In both SARS-CoV-1 and SARS-CoV-2, they are very easily transmitted. MERS is a little bit uncertain as to what extent they can be transmitted person to person. But these two, SARS-CoV-1 and SARS-CoV-2, they can be easily transmitted from person to person, which is what makes them so dangerous. So what's the difference between CoV-1 and CoV-2? Well, it's both fortunate and unfortunate in a way. It's fortunate in an epidemiological sense that SARS-CoV-1 is extremely virulent, and it has a very high mortality rate. It has a mortality rate overall 14 to 15%. CoV-2, our current one, is around about 2%, between 1 and 2% case mortality rate. CoV-1, high mortality rate, and especially in people over 60. Again, it was also spread by aerosol, etc. It was very contagious, just as SARS-CoV-2, our current COVID, is. But the difference is that the people who fell ill very quickly. And when they became ill, they became extremely ill with very, very marked symptoms. So they could be identified very quickly. And their illness was so spectacular that they were immediately put into isolation, immediately taken out of the population, put into isolation. And people who dealt with them very quickly learned to be dressed head to toe in protective gear and everything else. A very sad aspect of SARS-CoV-1 was that many of the people who died were in fact hospital workers. And there are many hospital workers who had nothing direct to do with the patient themselves. It was so contagious that it would spread in a hospital setting very easily. But the thing was that because of its spectacular symptoms, it had a very short prodromal phase, so people weren't wandering around spreading it wildly before they got sick. They got sick very quickly, and they got very, very sick. So they got it was easier to identify and isolate people, especially once it was realized that this had epidemic proportion. So that's a major difference to COVID the current COVID. Current COVID has a long prodromal phase when people can actually spread the illness around very widely. Even though it's got a lower mortality rate, it gets spread much more widely. So just briefly, I can't spend too much time discussing it. It arose in China, and it very, very rapidly spread to Hong Kong, Singapore, and then the really significant entry was to Canada. But this is because these places, Hong Kong, Taiwan, Singapore, Vietnam, and Canada, these were the places where people spread it person to person. It occurred elsewhere. It was spread elsewhere. It was spread to Europe and to the United States. But by the time that happened, it was very easily identified, and people were rigorously isolated. And it simply didn't spread any further. And I think, if I'm right, about 8,000 people in the end worldwide, about 8,000 were infected, and 774 died. Again, we dodged a bullet. And we dodged a bullet through rigorous epidemiological intervention. And also, it has to be said, because the Chinese authorities themselves made it well known that something bad was going on, so that people were well aware of what was there. Okay, so here is the virus that we need to talk about. This is our actually a generic view of coronaviruses, but this is what more or less what the current one looks like. Enveloped virus. Here are the viral proteins sticking out, and it's this one here that we're particularly interested in, because this is the one that governs binding and entry. And this is also the one that most of the vaccine effort is directed against. The vaccines are attempting to teach people's immune systems to produce antibody, which will stick to these spikes, stick virus together, and end up inactivating it. It is an RNA virus. It's a positive strand virus. In other words, its RNA strand is just like messenger RNA. It's enclosed in a capsid, in a spiral helical capsid, as you see here, and that is obviously enclosed in an envelope. So this is how SARS-CoV-2 gains entrance into the host cell. And what happens is, oops, sorry, I just need to, what happens is that the spikes adhere to a particular protein here. It's called the ACE2 protein. Its normal function is to transmit a signal into the center of the cell. It does not occur on all host cells. It occurs on respiratory cells, and it also occurs on endothelial cells, the cells that line the blood vessels, and a couple of other cells, the heart, cardiac tissue, for example. The virus binds, and it induces the cell to actually swallow the virus in what is called an endosome. If you remember back when we talked about cell structure and things, the virus is pulled into the cell in a vesicle, which is referred to as an endosome. And it's normally the way that a cell would take in food or something like that. Don't worry about this. This diagram is from an experimental paper, and there was something they were busy trying to do. That's got nothing to do with the functioning of the virus. So once it's taken into the cell here, you can see here's the endosome. The envelope merges with the membrane of the endosome, and it spits out the capsid. And the capsid is then digested off, and it releases the RNA strand. And the RNA, one of the first things that is read off, the ribosomes immediately start reading this RNA strand. One of the first proteins that is released is called a replicase, and it will reproduce the genome of the virus, lots and lots and lots and lots of copies. The rest of the genes produce all of the viral proteins. Those viral proteins need to be processed, and they are transported first to the endoplasmic reticulum, then to the Golgi apparatus, where the viral proteins are matured and they are embedded in membrane. And here you can see here, if you remember back to what you know about cell function, the Golgi buds off vesicles. This is a vesicle here. It would have been round, but with these proteins embedded in it. It kind of buckles in and packages the RNA strand of the virus, and it creates an entirely new viral particle there, enclosed, as you see here, enclosed in a vesicle, and the vesicle goes to the surface and buds the new viral particle out. So the cells, the machinery of the cell is totally disrupted except for what is useful to the virus. But the cell will last for quite a long time before it dies. And that's useful because it just carries on producing viral particles. But look at what I told you, where it can infect. It can infect respiratory tissue. It can infect the tissue of blood vessels, and it can infect things like the heart directly. This explains some of the sequelae of COVID infection that people have noted. Not only this respiratory infection, but also neurological, heart, blood vessel, blood clotting, all sorts of things can in fact be affected by the virus. So here are just some of the symptoms. There are one or two that are missing that I'll mention. But these tells you the commonest presenting symptoms for COVID infection. Fever is a primary presenting symptom. Fatigue, and then also this dry cough, which is a direct result of viral infection low down in the respiratory tract. This is not due to secondary infections. This is due to the virus itself. There is another symptom not noted here, which is fairly common, and that is loss of sense of smell and loss of taste because of infection by the virus of sensory nerve endings. The fatigue, which is commonly associated with influenza as well, about 40% of cases. Headache is not the most common. And symptoms of upper respiratory tract infection, like runny nose, that's sneezing, those sort of things, are actually usually minor. But a later, much more important symptom is this, and is characteristic, and that is shortness of breath, because things start to happen in the lung tissue that we'll discuss in a second. In comparison, here's a comparison of COVID symptoms with others. Fever, dry cough, shortness of breath. These are relatively common, especially later on in the infection. Common cold, no. Those things just very, very seldom occur. Headaches in COVID, they do occur, but they're not a major presenting symptom. But in influenza, they are. It's often the primary presenting symptom is severe headache. Influenza, seldom shortness of breath, but dry cough and fever, yes. So you'll see that it's relatively easy to confuse these. A patient presenting in a medical setting, presenting with some of these symptoms, and we don't, at the current time in fall, winter, they would probably be tested to see whether they had COVID virus or whether they had influenza virus, because it is possible to confuse them. Okay, so I do just want to, before I kind of leave COVID behind, I do just want to mention to you, I've been following the medical information about the vaccines, and it looks to me like those vaccines are extremely good. So those of you with doubts about having the vaccination, I would advise you that those vaccines look extremely good, and they will become available to you probably in the middle of next year. Before then, just remember what we've said about the spread of the virus. The same as influenza, it's spread by aerosol. And it's been shown that some of those aerosol droplets produced through perfectly normal speaking, etc., can last up to a quarter of an hour in the air. And even the smallest droplets, which are less than 5 microns big, remember, 5 microns, that's the size of an E. coli. Even a droplet that size can contain thousands of viral particles, which could cause infection. Especially now, we need ourselves to model mask usage, social distancing, that is, do not go into crowded facilities, do not go into facilities where people are not wearing masks, and stand away from people, because most of the respiratory droplets produced will fall within a distance of about 6 feet. Wash your hands, keep your hands clean. Why? Because it's perfectly easy to pick up stuff and inadvertently touch our faces, touch our eyes, touch our noses, whatever. We need to be very, very careful. This is not going to be a healthy Christmas. So and as people who understand some of this stuff, or the theory behind it, we need to be modeling for other people what they need to be doing. Okay, so I'm going to tell you a little bit about some of the other viruses. If I don't finish today, I will add this in as a little extra for you to do on your own, please. Okay, the next group of viruses that are of huge importance to human beings are the herpes viruses. And the herpes viruses, there is a tremendous range of impacts on human beings, all the way from causing minor inconveniences to causing major illness, and even producing tumors. So first of all, the ones that most people have been exposed to are the simplex viruses, the herpes simplex viruses, also often just abbreviated HSV. And these are strains 1 and 2. There's very little difference between those two strains. Herpes simplex 1 tends to cause oral lesions, and those are common cold sores, things like that. 2 tends to be more common as a genital infection, but they can swap over. You can get 2 as an oral infection, you can get 1 as a genital infection. All of the herpes viruses have a characteristic that there is usually an initial infection, which is fairly acute. It usually produces painful lesions, for instance, on the mouth, painful lesions on the genitals. It then resolves, but typically for herpes virus, it becomes latent. Many of the herpes viruses, in fact, become incorporated into the genome of nerve cells. And then every now and again, for unknown reasons, they begin to replicate, and they cause lesions, often on the surface of the skin. So you probably know, a lot of you probably had oral herpes, the common cold sores, and you'll realize as you get older that in fact it's eventually, usually just stops when you're in your 20s or so. Often you just never ever get it again, but the virus in fact is still present. It's just completely silenced, and it is probably silenced by your immune system. It probably just can never replicate enough to cause problems again. That is true for both of them, for oral and for genital herpes. Now, there are genetic differences. Some people have lifelong problems with the infection, but in most people, in fact, although the virus is definitely there, they say herpes is forever. Yes, but if you have, I've talked particularly about genital herpes. If you have genital herpes, do not go into a panic and into a major depression and think your life is over. It is not. It is quite possible in both cases that it eventually resolves, and after maybe you've even had 1 or 2 outbreaks, it resolves itself and it just becomes latent and never reappears. I will tell you more about that in a little while. Varicella zoster is closely related to the herpes simplex virus. Varicella zoster virus causes 2 diseases. It causes, well, they're the same disease, but 2 different sets of symptoms. That's chickenpox and shingles. I'll show you that now. Roseola virus, it causes particularly a mild disease in infants. We're not going to talk about that anymore. Then this group here are the Epstein-Barr viruses, a diverse group. These are the cause of mononucleosis, for example, mild illness, but there are other Epstein-Barr herpes viruses which cause a tumorous condition called Burkitt's lymphoma, which actually, by the way, responds. There are treatments for it. Responds well to treatment. The last one is this one here, Kaposi's sarcoma, and I'll tell you more about that in a minute. It's strongly associated with HIV. Okay, so here are our some symptoms of the cold sores, etc. Cold sores are contagious. It can easily be spread. If you have but they are spread typically. Both cold sores and genital herpes are spread when there is an active lesion, not when the virus is latent, not when it's hidden away and silent. It's when they are actually produced. They produce a serum, like it's painful, open sore, and it leaks serum, and that serum is extremely rich in viral particles. And then after 10 days or whatever, it will resolve itself and stop. Commonly, people associate this with, they say cold sores because if people get stressed in the very, very cold weather, there seems to be some association. Anything which stresses the tissues seems to predispose to it. And some people associate it with personal stress as well. I don't know how true that is. And often the reason that there's an outbreak is completely obscure. We don't know why they do it. But as I say, later, as you mature and everything, they often disappear and never reappear. There are medications which will shorten the duration of any outbreak. This is genital herpes on the penis, extremely, extremely painful. And in men, it will immediately get them to the doctor because it also produces often a very severe urethritis, burning on urination. There are some antivirals, again, that will shorten any outbreak. As I say, in men, it's easily noticeable. In women, it may not be that noticeable. Lesions may be high in the vagina, and they may not be as noticeable. Now, that is important, particularly if a woman becomes pregnant, because there is a condition called neonatal herpes, which is a life-threatening illness, which is an infection of the infant as it passes through the vagina, and it can be extremely serious. If you've ever had genital herpes and you fall pregnant, it's very important to tell obstetrician gynecologists that is the case, because they will examine very carefully to see if you have active lesions, may be able to give you medication before birth to suppress lesions. and if need be, do a cesarean delivery. There is also one other thing just to warn you about. There's a condition called herpes keratitis, which is an infection of the eye. It often presents as a really mild symptoms like of conjunctivitis and everything, and often will pass off. The herpes infection will just pass off. But it's one reason why you should never, never, ever, ever put steroids anywhere near your eyes or near a sore on your face. If you use steroids, it actually opens up cells to infection by the herpes virus, and it can produce a very, very severe herpes keratitis and an inflammation and ulceration of the cornea, with resulting damage to the cornea and even blindness. Anything like conjunctivitis, anything like that, you can treat it symptomatically, but make sure you're not using anything with steroids in the eye drops. So this is chickenpox caused by varicella zoster. In children, it varies from being a relatively mild illness with these very irritating pox on the skin and pus-filled sores, which are often intensely itchy. It's associated with a fever and everything, but in children, often it will simply pass off without treatment. However, it can also be extremely dangerous in children. It is not a desirable thing to have your children exposed to chickenpox. And there is a very, very good vaccine which is available. And the incidence of chickenpox had been falling prodigiously in the United States ever since vaccines were introduced. Unfortunately now, the anti-vaccine movement has led to many people withdrawing their children from vaccination programs, and chickenpox is epidemic every year in certain regions of the country, with often very serious consequences for children. It can have very, very severe impact on children. It can lead to blindness, it can lead to lung infections and all sorts of things. The most common complication is that these sores are open sores. They run and they get infected, very, very itchy. So it's very difficult to get children to stop scratching them. So that is the disease itself. But the real interesting thing about chickenpox is that once you've had it, typical for all the herpes viruses, it becomes latent. And it may remain latent for your entire life. But as you age particularly, you become susceptible to a second occurrence of the virus. And now it presents much more like a herpes virus. Again, it's in nerve endings. And it erupts on the surface of the skin in intensely painful blisters. And it can have all sorts of other effects as well. It produces pain in the muscles associated, and unfortunately, it can repeat. It can occur repeatedly after that. Most commonly in people who are getting older. But fortunately, now there's a very good vaccine called Zostavax, and there's another one now as well. And if you are advising parents or whatever, and they tell you, oh, they had chickenpox when they were children, then they should definitely have the shingles vaccination. The shingles can be a really debilitating illness. Here, this is what it's like. This pattern here is typical. What it is there's a nerve trunk that runs and opens. It's all the nerve endings from that nerve trunk are in a single block like this, and that nerve has been infected with the virus, and it's emerged here on the skin. Here is the last of the herpes virus, I think. that we're going to talk about. And this is again, a lot of the herpesviruses are rather strange. This is a virus called Kaposi sarcoma. And Kaposi sarcoma, the virus, it is a cancerous lesion, but it causes the development of many blood vessels in a sort of a knot underneath the skin and produces these purple lesions, which are typical. What is interesting about it is that this virus is extremely rare, and it only occurs in, it occurs predominantly in elderly Jewish men of Ashkenazi European Jewish descent. And it never ever killed anybody. It's very, in elderly men, it's very slow moving. It can be slightly disfiguring, but it doesn't kill anybody. And in the 1980s, this rare herpes virus-induced tumor began to appear in young, healthy gay men. And this was the first indication, one of the first indications that the immunodeficiency virus had entered the human population. And the reason for this is the virus may be actually widespread through the population, but our immune systems are so good at dealing with it that it never gets anywhere until, if you're an elderly Jewish man, eventually, as you get towards the end of your life, your immune system can't control it anymore and it pops up here and there. But in these young men, it turned into a virulent, highly malignant cancer, which killed. It would move into the lungs, into the bone marrow, into the brain, all over the place, and would actually kill people. And it's one of the markers of AIDS, acquired immunodeficiency syndrome. Okay, so a couple more of diseases that affect the skin. These are called the paramyxoviruses, and they again these are common childhood illnesses. But when we say common childhood illnesses, never ever think that that means that they are just mild and that they are tolerable. They are not. All of these childhood diseases have a certain mortality, and many of them have very serious sequelae, that is, after effects, long lasting or lifelong after effects to them. This is measles, which is one of the most dangerous of all of them. Measles is an entirely human disease. There's no animal reservoir or anything. But it is incredibly contagious, one of the most contagious of all of the viruses that we know of. And again, it is transmitted largely through respiratory droplets. And it has various, really, there are some real telling signs about measles itself. The first is they're called Koplik spots. And if you look along a gum line inside the mouth, there sort of thing, there are these red patches that appear. And then there is this, later on, there is this development of this rash all over the body. But measles carries a very high risk. It has a relatively high mortality for a childhood illness, and also has many secondary effects as well. It's not something that you want to subject your children to. So there's a very good vaccine, the measles, mumps, rubella vaccine, which takes care of it, which very largely we were on our way to eliminating measles as a childhood illness completely, until again, anti-vaccine organizations and people started to suggest that this vaccination, the measles, mumps, rubella vaccine, caused autism. There is no association. Millions and upon millions of dollars have been spent now examining any possible link between the two. There is no link. The original study was based on flagrantly made up data and was ultimately withdrawn. But the rumor and the lie have been spread ever since. Now, there's two things about measles. First of all, it's a serious childhood illness. It is not a mild childhood illness. There are dangers of neurological involvement in children, of eye involvement, lungs, all sorts of things can happen to a child. But there is also a strange association, and this is that measles, it doesn't go latent, but it can withdraw as a subclinical infection. It's a continuous infection, but it is subclinical. And decades later, it flowers again, but now as a very, very serious illness called Paget's disease, which is a neurological disease called, if the whole name, subacute sclerosing panencephalitis. All you've got to look at is misspelled, I see. Panencephalitis, inflammation of the brain, and it is almost invariably fatal. And along with the disappearance of the disease as a childhood illness with the vaccine, this Paget's disease began to disappear from the population. And presumably, it will start to make its reappearance once those children who have had the measles start to enter the correct age group. That we'll probably see Paget's disease appear again. MMR, measles. Now we look at mumps. Mumps is called infectious parotitis, also a paramyxovirus, and it causes this in children, this characteristic swollen lymph nodes, not lymph node, salivary glands around the neck. It is often a relatively mild disease in children, and it's caused by inflammation of this symptom is caused by inflammation of the salivary glands. Again, spread by respiratory droplets. But in adults, it can be extremely serious. And many, many adults do not have mumps when they are children, and then acquire it as an adult. And in males, it leads to prodigious swelling of the testicles, which can result in sterility. It can also, in females, lead to swelling of the ovaries, but that is not nearly as serious. The testicles are enclosed in a tough connective tissue enclosure, and they swell within that. And that is what causes disruption of all of the tissues and can lead to sterility. Can also cause, in adults, inflammation of the pancreas with a resulting diabetes, secondary diabetes, and it can also cause an encephalitis. So being vaccinated, as children is a very good idea, not only to prevent the child getting it, but to prevent any adults' involvement. Again, measles, mumps, and rubella. Now, rubella is also called German measles, and it's again spread by respiratory droplets, but it's usually a very, very mild disease, very mild in children, and even in most adults, if they got it, it's a relatively mild disease. So why worry about it? Why include that in a vaccine? Well, first of all, you want to prevent it. Even that usually mild disease could have consequences, but it's very serious in adult women who are pregnant, because adult women who are pregnant in early stages of pregnancy acquire rubella. Their children, the fetus, may be very, very adversely affected, and it can induce very severe developmental defects in children. This is the main reason why rubella is widely vaccinated for, and this association has largely disappeared in pregnant women. Let me see where I am. Okay, I'll finish with this, with the papillomavirus. Papillomaviruses are another of the viruses which most of us have had, commonly a skin infection, and there are many strains of papillomavirus. The one set of strains cause these common warts, much more common in children, quite contagious, and can also be spread from place to place on the skin. But this is one of those viruses our immune system eventually learns to recognize it, and we just usually stop getting warts after a certain age. So this is a nuisance, basically. But there is another strain of papillomavirus which causes genital warts. Now, genital warts are incredibly common. It's one of the commonest sexually transmitted diseases around. Very, very common in young people who are sexually active. Again, the warts themselves are more of a nuisance than anything else. They are relatively easily treated, although it may be complicated because of the structure of the genitals and everything else. Certainly not anything that somebody would treat on their own. These kind of warts, common warts, you can treat with over-the-counter medications. Genital warts need to be dealt with by a doctor. They're usually burned off with liquid nitrogen. There are some medications and things which can be used, but they need to be treated very, very carefully. But again, the warts themselves is not the end of the world, and it's more of a nuisance, an ugly nuisance, than anything else. Unfortunately, these genital warts have another effect, and that is that they are oncogenic. Remember what I told you about oncogenic viruses. They are associated with neoplastic change, that is, change of cells to tumorous cells, particularly of the genitals, and especially of the cervix. This is cervix here, where it now is not appearing as warts. The virus here has acted as on oncogenes and has changed the division status and changed them to a cancerous status. And this is an extremely dangerous cancer. It's one of those cancers that women should be examined for regularly, every year at least. Anybody who has ever been sexually active has probably been exposed to the virus at least. And it's not all strains of the papillomavirus that will do it, but definitely this is a strong association. There is an excellent vaccine called, actually there's more than one now, this one called Gardasil, which is extremely effective. But the problem is it needs to be administered before sexual activity begins, because the virus is so common that as soon as people become sexually active, they are likely to be exposed. And so the vaccine should be administered before puberty, and I believe it's done twice, and maybe one after puberty begins. Both boys and girls should get it. The tumor situation is much more common in girls, but it can cause penile cancer in men as well. That is rare, but it does occur. And boys should get the vaccine so that they do not spread it, so they don't act as carriers of the virus. I'll finish with this. This is from Australia, just to show you. This is the incidence of cervical cancer in Australia. Just follow the line, and here's where the papillomavirus vaccination programs began. Look at the incidence of cervical cancer, plummeting, absolutely plummeting in response to that vaccination program. It's a very good vaccine, and strongly advised. If you have children, make sure that your children get their vaccines before they become sexually active. Okay, I'm going to stop there. I will do a little separate thing on human immunodeficiency virus and post it for you. But I think your brains are probably as full as mine are now. Does anybody have any questions?
No, thank you.
Are you sure?
I have a question.
Yes, go ahead.
So, for the influenza, you said that there's two types of spikes, the hematoglutinin and the neuraminidase.
That's correct, yes.
So, when it changes, because the strains change every single year, it's the same protein with different structures?
Yes, it's just small. The drift is just very small changes, maybe an amino acid or two or something like that in the protein. And then the antigenic shift, there is some major change in the structure, so that it is totally unrecognizable.
Okay, thank you.
Anyone else? Okay, then look after yourselves, please, and make sure wear your mask, socially distance, wash your hands, do all the things that good microbiologists would do. Okay, and I'll see you next week.
Take care.
You too. Bye bye.